you go ahead and just sort of tick off your credentials for the audience really quick? Let them get a sense of who you are and what you've done.
Certainly. Well, I want to call most of them credentials. It's all been like mostly intern and volunteer work for the most part.
Right.
But yeah, so I worked for Duff Sondheim's campaign. Duff Sondheim was was one of the candidates for U.S. Senator from California in the 2016 election. I was his body man and one of his research aides, and that was a lot of fun. You got to drive him all over California. I interned at the American Interest magazine as an editorial assistant and did a lot of stuff with Adam Garfinkel and Walter Russell Mead, and did a lot of writing and research stuff there. I'm actually working with them nowadays too. On some various other projects. So those are the two main things. I also do research for a guy named Joel Kotkin, who is a kind of an interesting thinker.
Yeah.
Also a political misfit. Hopefully you can have him on the show one of these days. And he's
Joel's a Democrat, right?
He is a Democrat, but he's one of those Democrats who is truly a Democrat in name only.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, is that so? Well, I mean, you've never had any problems with working with people from both sides of the aisle.
No, never at all. I mean, the more partisan you get, the harder it can be to have like table conversations.
Yeah,
but
right.
generally, like if you're a political hack like me, you're able to go do this kind of stuff and be a chameleon and slide into different roles.
Well, see, that's the funny thing, though, because to me, and I understand what you're saying, but you're really not a political hack. To me, a political hack is the type of individual who is in politics just to be in front of the camera, just to get votes, just to, I don't know, sort of win a victory for his team against the other team. In other words, it's personality-driven, it's ego-driven, right?
And you're saying I'm not that?
I don't think.
Well, John, that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me.
I'm not saying that you don't. I'm not saying that you don't have an ego. Of course, look, you have to have a little bit of a, sort of an elevated sense of yourself to be in politics to begin with.
Right.
I think,
right.
Because ultimately, to be in politics is to sort of assume that you have some right or justification to influence the way other people think, whether you're a candidate for office or a speechwriter or something else, But I think that you're an ideas person, which is why I was interested in talking with you. And so, on the subject of ideas, now, I'm going to assume, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going to assume that somewhere along the course of your political career, you've had the charge leveled against you that you are a rhino. Is that something that's happened to you?
Plenty
before?
of times, plenty of names, all the time.
Right, and so for our audience, you and I met originally through the No Labels.
Yes.
Network,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
I was interested in getting involved with No Labels. And people who know anything about my political career, such as it has been, they know that I'm not a partisan person. I'm a person of very defined sort of political principles, I think. But party labels don't mean a lot to me, and I think it's one of the problems that we can't figure out ways to even communicate across party lines. So, but that's how you and I got connected, because you were
Right.
referred to me because you were involved with that. The No Labels thing in Los Angeles seems to have kind of, I don't know what happened.
Well, the No Labels nationally seems to have had some of a similar thing happen. I don't really know what's happening
And
there either.
there's something to be said about the sort of, non-viability of most centrist movements in America. I wouldn't call New Era America, centrist per se, but it's centrist in the sense that we do want to establish a new center, philosophical center that allows for conversation to take place between the polarized sides, right?
Right.
So in that sense, it's centrist, but we're not advocating a specified sort of agenda. We're trying to create an atmosphere for conversation and collaboration. But having said that, I know you well enough to know that you have a very particular sort of philosophical outlook. And the thing I was going to say very quickly is that, so people have called you a rhino, and I understand why they do, because in a number of ways
I have a large horn coming out of my nose.
Well,
so
there is that when you don't use your facial cream, right? But but there's the fact that you are, in some ways, I think you would refer to yourself as a progressive Republican. Am I wrong on that?
Yeah, I've called myself that before.
Right,
I call myself other names nowadays, but that's something I would identify by. So,
now, the reason people would hear anybody who calls themselves, in any respect, I think a progressive Republican is somebody who's inviting a lot of antipathy from certain folks. But the reason I don't think calling an individual such as yourself a rhino is a fair charge is because of the fact that the Republican Party historically has not really been a conventionally conservative party.
Right.
The Republican Party became generally conservative, I think, starting with Ronald Reagan in the 80s. Now, there's a certain conservative lineage in the party that can be traced from Ronald Reagan back to Barry Goldwater, when the party was still much more moderate, but Goldwater sort of seized the enthusiasm of the conservative base. And I guess maybe you could trace it from Reagan to Goldwater, maybe back to Calvin Coolidge. I mean, you probably know more about Coolidge.
Yeah, no, well, you know, you're hitting me where I live. This is exactly the kind of stuff I like to think about all the time.
Is Coolidge accurately thought of as, I know he lowered taxes, was Coolidge accurately thought of as an ancestor to Reagan and Goldwater in the policy sphere?
So he was an ancestor of them policy-wise, but he was not necessarily the direct inspiration for them. He was one of various streams that went into the broader conservative river by the mid-20th century and late 20th century. So the way I look at the Republican Party is you need to understand something at its foundations to understand it as it develops, right? And whereas the Democrats have always been almost always a coalition of various interest groups and various groups of workers, laborers, that kind of thing, immigrants, the Republican Party has always been basically upper class, businessy professionals with various competing ideological goals.
And so to just allow me to finish establishing that parallel, so you do have this conservative lineage, which you can argue at least goes from Reagan to Goldwater to Coolidge, arguably.
At the very least, possibly a little bit further, too.
Yeah, okay, possibly a little bit further. But on the other hand, I mean, you have more of this sort of gentry of the Republican Party that you're talking about, this strand of the Republican Party, which really was mainstream for so much of the party's history, that you can easily trace back from, I think, maybe George Herbert Walker Bush, possibly, but certainly from Nixon back to
Eisenhower,
Rockefeller, to Teddy Roosevelt, Nelson Rockefeller afterwards, really all the way back to Abraham Lincoln. I think you can argue that. I think that it's probably, if you look at Lincoln's sort of willingness to use the muscular force of the federal government. Of course, we were in a civil war, right? But even so, I mean, you can look at the whole range of Lincoln's policies and so forth, and think and argue that our first Republican president, from a policy standpoint, probably had more in common with Richard Nixon than he did with Ronald Reagan.
I think that's very right.
But go ahead and finish illustrating that, that spectrum within Republican Party history.
Certainly. So the Republican Party, as it would act in the 20th century, was basically set up, I would say, by the 1890s, right? In the 1890s, who were your main Republican kind of figures? They were like what a lot of people call like the corrupt side of the party that was in the pockets of the robber barons. It's more complicated than that, but that's the kind of image you get. People like William McKinley, right? Who were a nationalist, but they were very pro-business kind of thing. Then you had the progressives in the Republican Party. Along the lines of Theodore Roosevelt and some of his followers, and they directly transferred their ideology and their thinking from an update of Abraham Lincoln's version of the American system, which has further roots even further back in American
history. Would it be fair to say that these were Republicans who were friendlier to the idea of expanding the social safety net?
Certainly. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt basically laid half the blueprint of the New Deal, which is something a lot of people forget nowadays, but that was very much so. Yeah. You didn't necessarily have small government conservatives so much as you had business class Republican conservatives. Right. And that was the legacy that Hoover, Harding, and Coolidge all were basically in. I would say they were distinct from Teddy Roosevelt. They were influenced by Teddy Roosevelt, but they were more influenced by the William McKinley, Ulysses S. Grant kind of earlier big business kind of tradition, right?
So take us to the point, if you can, where modern conservatism, because it's interesting. My understanding of the genesis of modern conservatism is that it is, ironically, a relatively new phenomenon in American politics. Relatively, like mid-20th century, right? Now, conservatism is meant to sort of hearken to the foundational pillars of our society, particularly when we talk about, the classical liberal roots of freedom of expression, individual liberties, and so forth, but also with an emphasis on, I think, Judeo-Christian values is undergirding our moral culture. And so that sort of lends itself to the themes of the modern conservative movement. But the modern conservative movement was really popularized by William F. Buckley in the 60s.
Yes.
And, I feel bad because there's a book written in 1953. What was it called? Do you recall?
Which by whom?
Oh goodness! It was the book that's sort of credited with catalyzing.
So The Conscience of a Conservative,
Conscience of a
by
Conservative.
Barry Goldwater was, I think, 1960 or
Okay,
62. Yeah,
okay,
a little bit later.
Goldwater
But,
did,
but
well,
1950.
there's one prior to that. Though.
Well, 1955 was the founding of National Review magazine.
That's true.
And there were a bunch of books around that time. I'm not familiar with the exact ones.
See, now I feel bad. I feel like I'm doing disservice to our audience because there's one thing in particular I'm trying to think of.
There are some books. Just read a lot of books. You'll find one of these.
But
books.
point being is that this intellectual movement really came to life in the 50s.
Yes.
And so how was that a break from the past when this thinking started to come about, would you say?
So I'll back us up back to the 1920s, right?
Okay.
So 1920s, you had the kind of end of the old business class Republicans in power, right? 1928 election happens, and Hoover gets in, and then you have Republican majorities in the House and Congress.
Right.
Then the Great Depression happens in 1929. That sweeps FDR and the New Deal coalition into power, and they hold power for basically the next 2 decades. Republicans are shut out of the national government for the most part. And FDR and Harry Truman totally reorient how politics is based. Right. The old business class republicanism is based by a bureaucratic class Democrat system. I don't want to say democracy, but a Democrat-dominated kind of system. That's the environment that by the late 1940s and early 1950s, you have intellectuals like William F. Buckley, Ayn Rand, Irving Kristol starting to rethink different kinds of liberalism and orient them into a new kind of conservatism. Now, there's a really important name in the 40s and early 50s named Robert Taft, who was, I believe, the son or grandson of President William H. Taft.
Who was sort of considered a conservative relative to Teddy Roosevelt anyway. Who
Very
was
much so.
progressive. So there was a conservative-progressive divide
Yes.
within the Republican Party.
But it
back
wasn't
then.
ideological. It was cultural, primarily. William F. Buckley, more than anyone else, crystallized it into something that could be popular beyond just the cultural confines of the Midwest and South,
Right.
and could be popular among the people of the new suburbs of the Eisenhower years and all that kind of stuff. Now there's a couple trends to watch, and I promise I won't bore the audience too much with this, but
We're going to have some wonks watching. Watching this. This is definitely educational hour.
I hope so, I hope I don't get too much.
But I'm enjoying it. There are a lot of nerds out there.
Yeah. Well,
enjoy
we
this.
are some of the salt of the earth, you know. So yeah. But 1950s. Bear in mind, Dwight Eisenhower was in power.
Right.
Dwight Eisenhower was president of the United States. He didn't have Republican Congresses, but he was president of the United States.
Okay.
And a lot of conservatives in the Taft tradition, and William F. Buckley, and you could probably say some of the early neoconservatives on the Republican side, like Irving Kristol, saw Eisenhower basically expanding the New Deal and reforming the New Deal, and saw that as not a betrayal, but a what are we doing here? Why do we exist as a party if we're doing basically what the Democrats want to do? Right. So what National Review and editors like James Burnham and Frank Meyer and William F. Buckley did was they tried to create an alternative consensus called fusionism based on a much more aggressive posture against the Soviet Union on foreign policy, a much more libertarian economic agenda that was partly influenced by the objectivists and libertarians, but they've shut them out of the movement for a couple decades, and then was also socially traditionalist as opposed to the materialism and the eventual what some would call hedonism of the 1960s, right? But
It was a fun time.
Yeah, you could say that. So this conservative movement inspired people like Barry Goldwater, but it's important to know that they were never the primary force in the Republican politics. The primary force in Republican politics was the Eastern establishment: Dwight Eisenhower, Nelson Rockefeller, Richard Nixon, William Scranton, all these kinds of guys who were pragmatic. You could say they were boring. You could say they were fuddy-duddies who just wanted to do things right and tie everybody's shoes and all that. But they were pragmatists fundamentally.
Pragmatists, they're wealthy businessmen.
Yes.
I mean, Teddy Roosevelt's father, I can't remember what industry he was in, but
he was an aristocrat, though.
He was an aristocrat.
Yeah.
He was an American aristocrat.
Yeah.
And Teddy had more of a reformist sort of mindset and so forth. But yeah, so that northeastern sort of elite capitalist establishment, right? This is the elite of the Republican Party. It still sort of is.
Right.
But I guess a lot of the sort of thinking of regular Republicans stemmed from, that cultural center of society.
Yeah, that says these people, these New Deal Democrats and these Rockefeller Republicans are not really representing the interests of the American people. And they had a very important point in that.
This is what the now conservative Republicans, this new generation of conservative Republicans are saying, the Buckley generation, National Review, and so forth.
Exactly.
Goldwater.
And Nixon was very much an establishment East Coast Republican, but in his temperament, he was very much an anti-establishment populist.
Right. So let's jump into the 60s.
Yes.
Let's jump into the 60s here, because what winds up happening, part of what I recall, is that you have this shift where Goldwater comes in, right? And I don't know, did Goldwater refer to himself as a libertarian?
No, never.
So that wasn't a term that was used, but
Yeah.
certainly, I mean, his philosophy, is pretty akin to libertarianism, right? Or at least
In some ways, not on foreign affairs, because on
Not
foreign
on-
affairs he
no.
was a rollback kind of like let's bomb China kind of.
Well, that's right,
guy, yeah.
because what did the Democratic Party had that campaign commercial. What was it? Barry Goldwater had a slogan. He said, "In your heart, you know he's right." Right?
No,
And
that was that was Barry
it's
Goldwater.
In your heart, you know he's right. Right? And Johnson countered, and the Democrats countered with a TV commercial that showed an image of an atom bomb exploding, right?
Yep.
Igniting the Cold War into a hot war and ushering in nuclear holocaust.
Right.
And at the end of that commercial, there was a tagline that said, "In your heart, you know he might."
Yes.
Talking about Barry Goldwater. So
One of the most brilliant things of all time, yeah.
So obviously, so Barry Goldwater wouldn't have fit in with the Ron Paul foreign policy.
Not
view of the
in particular.
world.
So.
But it's interesting because, so now this new small government conservative ideology comes in the 50s and really becomes popularized within the parties in the 60s.
Right.
But it doesn't really take a permanent hold over the base of the party until the sort of previously Democratic South comes into the Republican Party, right? And so it's an interesting thing because a lot of people will look at the legacy of Barry Goldwater and say, well, hey, look, Barry Goldwater was basically a racist, right? And even in his own time, and keep in mind, this was a time where you did have a fairly sizable number of African American Republicans.
Yes.
I think about 32% of black people voted for Richard Nixon
Yes.
against John Kennedy.
And Richard Nixon, of all people, too,
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so go ahead.
Right, well, Richard Nixon. But, Richard Nixon had been Dwight Eisenhower's
Yes.
vice president. And Dwight Eisenhower integrated the armed forces.
Right.
And Nixon had a strong relationship with the black business class and so forth, Goldwater, however, was a proponent of the constitutionality of segregation. Right.
Yes.
So he was a political opponent of the Civil Rights Act, and I presume of at least elements of the Voting Rights Act as well.
Yes.
But he certainly believed that a private business owner had the right to either serve or not serve whoever he wanted. So that created this sort of interesting alliance where you had small government conservatives like Buckley, like Goldwater, and others, who in and of themselves, I think if you look closely at these men, I don't think there's much reason to think that they were personal racists.
Not at
they
all.
had antipathy towards people based off of the color of their skin, right? But which isn't to say that some of Buckley's views and maybe Goldwater's too weren't socially backwards in a lot of ways. I mean, that may be another conversation. But Goldwater, and I heard a story about Goldwater once. I think he was on a school board or administrator of some school or district or something like that back in Arizona. Was it Phoenix? I can't recall.
I forget where he
Well, I think, long story short, I think Goldwater actually had a personal role in integrating a local school district, if I'm not mistaken. It was something along those lines. But his view of the law and of the Constitution was that it was an infringement upon personal liberties. So you had sort of Dixiecrats in the South who were motivated oftentimes by racial animus and a belief that blacks and whites just should not, or could not get along or integrate in areas of education and commerce and so forth. And so they were able to take the small government argument and use it to protect states' rights, which was, the mandate to discriminate, so on and so forth. So this is where you have the big switch, because Goldwater loses in a landslide to Johnson. He loses the support of prominent Republicans like George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, like Jackie Robinson, first African-American baseball player, Major League Baseball player. But he does pull a great deal of his support from the South, correct? And going forward, Ronald Reagan comes in and solidifies that coalition. And
Never mind, Richard Nixon did that too.
well, that's true.
It's
I
a
mean,
complicated story.
right. Well, Nixon, right, and that's where the Southern strategy
Yes.
was born, right? Where where Nixon, and by the way, this isn't conjecture. I mean, Nixon's aides are on record, admitting to the fact that they sought to appeal to the prejudice of former Democratic voters in the South without necessarily actually rolling back the protections that had been instituted.
Yes.
Right, through these civil rights reforms. So Nixon wasn't actually trying to undo the Civil Rights Act.
No.
But he wanted to sort of emotionally and culturally empathize with these white Southern voters, right? Because Johnson had already picked up such a major share of the black vote. And I wish I could recall the quote, but basically what Nixon's aide said was that it was worth it to them to never get more than 20 or even 10% of the black vote ever again, so long as they could clean up in the South and replace the voters that they had lost to Johnson, to the Democratic Party.
They also said, though, on a policy standpoint, watch what we do, not what we say. And if you look at the legacy of the Nixon administration, I do believe the Southern strategy was the true sin of that administration policy-wise. But on the other hand, they desegregated Southern schools at a rate that no president had ever done before. There was the beginnings of a lot of affirmative action policy and all that kind of stuff. So it's a complicated, hairy, messy narrative, like most things in politics.
Well, I do know that you have a picture of Richard Nixon fighting alongside Captain America in your in your dorm room or something like that. Basically, this guy is the world's biggest Nixon. And we can talk about that.
Yeah, let's do so.
Plenty to be said about Nixon beyond just Watergate.
Right.
Okay, so look, so the history of the Republican Party is much.
I don't live in a dorm either, by the way.
No.
Yeah.
So the philosophical and intellectual and social history of the Republican Party is something that's much more dynamic than people realize.
You mind if I talk a little bit about what happened in the 50s and 60s real quick?
Okay.
Okay. So it's the big story, and Goldwater, Nixon, and Reagan are the three main actors in this story. Is the transition of the parties from being the Eisenhower, Rockefeller kind of consensus to the Reagan, Jack Kemp, Barry Goldwater kind of consensus throughout the.
Who are those three figures you said? You said Nixon,
Reagan, and Goldwater are the three main figures.
Okay, right.
Goldwater was kind of a John the Baptist figure. Nixon, I would be hesitant to give him a New Testament. But Reagan was in many ways, and in many ways still is, kind of the Christ figure.
Maybe Nixon was sort of the Judas.
You could call it that. You could call it that. It's important to know that up through the Ford administration, I mean, Nelson Rockefeller was vice president of the United States. These Republicans really were the moderate type were really important in the party up through the late 70s.
Right.
Watergate, though, just left such a not just a bad taste, but a true level of disgust among Republican voters and among the general electorate that I would say that was the real thing. It wasn't Goldwater's loss. It wasn't Eisenhower's death. It was really Watergate that destroyed the tradition of modern republicanism as an institutional force. There are still modern Republicans. They're just not institutionalized.
So that opened the door for the Reagan coalition.
And Reagan was not intentionally trying to create a radical movement or anything like that. And I think Reagan was actually fairly moderate in terms of a practical policy statement, and even rhetorically. But
he did reduce taxes in a way that could only be looked at as revolutionary, I think.
Very true.
We went from, Kennedy took the top rate from 90 to 71%.
Reagan went from 70
to 28%.
Exactly.
So, in that sense, he was,
There was a revolution in governance, but bear in mind, he didn't do anything to repeal the New Deal. He didn't do anything to reverse containment. In fact, he only advanced containment, I think. He was, and socially, he stepped away from the kind of counterculture stuff and was probably very Nixonian in terms of appealing to the working class people. But he wasn't a kind of Ted Cruz kind of figure the way a lot of people like to assume he was truly radical.
And yet the moral majority came to life during Reagan's time.
Yes.
It was part of what ushered him. There was the sort of tradition of American presidents speaking in an evangelical language. That's also not really as old. Well, It's not
No,
exactly as
you're
old,
right.
old a tradition as people think it is. I mean,
Right.
certainly if you go back and you listen to Lincoln and the Founding Fathers, there's frequent references to God. But
Right.
the language of evangelical,
Right.
Protestant
Right.
Christianity and so forth doesn't really suffuse the constant language of American presidents until Jimmy Carter.
Yes.
Interestingly enough,
Yes.
Carter was an evangelical Southern Democrat,
Yep.
the
Yep.
last one. And so, we look back on him, particularly Republicans look back at him and say, man, this guy was a liberal loon, which, he was
Maybe on foreign policy,
maybe
but-
that's not fair. Maybe it's fair, maybe it's not fair. I'm not
Right.
passing judgment on that. But it's just interesting to think that the Christian coalition was something that sort of Carter
Yeah.
headed up before Reagan.
And
sort
then
of
Reagan
took it over.
institutionalizes it, and then Bill Clinton, George W. Bush,
Right.
even Barack
Yeah.
Obama to a different degree,
Yeah.
took that language. Yeah,
Right,
I
that's
completely
right.
agree. It's
That's right,
an evolution of the American civil
Minus
religion.
George
to that
Herbert
effect.
Walker Bush, every one of those presidents spoke a Christian language
Yeah,
in one way
yeah.
or another.
And Herbert Walker Bush, I mean, New World Order, like it's not necessarily a biblical allusion, but it's a different kind of thing than you would have heard maybe Eisenhower or Truman speaking about.
Yeah, that may be. Although, like you said, I'm not sure how Christian that is.
No, yeah.
And, George
It's
Herbert Walker-
Illuminati,
George
actually.
Herbert Walker Bush wasn't really sort of the Christian. that
No,
George-
not at all.
that George
Actually,
W.
Herbert Walker
was.
Bush was probably the last gasp of the Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford style of Republican.
Right.
But like a hybrid of that between the Reagan years and the Eisenhower years kind of thing. Foreign policy-wise, Herbert Walker Bush was very much like in the tradition of Nixon and Kissinger and Ford. Domestic policy-wise, he was a lot closer to Reagan, though. So it's he's also an
No,
interesting
but
figure.
George Herbert Walker Bush raised taxes, right?
Yes.
And didn't George Herbert Walker Bush also sort of pioneer the notion of cap and trade and some of the regulatory
He
policies?
did, and he also was instrumental in getting the Americans with Disabilities Act passed, which has echoes in the Environmental Protection Agency and the Occupational Safety and Health Agency too.
It always seemed to me that when Reagan came along, the party had sort of decisively shifted in this conservative direction.
Yeah.
And that George Herbert Walker Bush was sort of an anomaly in as much as he was Reagan's vice president as a concession to that old sort
In a
of
way,
more moderate faction.
but the thing
right?
I would just always keep in mind is politicians are never a pure exemplar of a particular time and place, except maybe Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz. But most politicians are exemplars of older traditions, but adapted to newer circumstances. And especially if you're vice president of the United States for 8 years under Ronald Reagan, you're going to be more conservative than you would have been in the 60s or 70s, kind of.
Gotcha.
So, but anyways, back to what happened with the Republican Party, though. I think Reagan didn't do anything in terms of radicalizing the party. I think he institutionalized a system where conservatism was the norm, but it was no more radical than what Robert Taft would have been doing 30 years before. And I think Reagan actually was not really as fully on board with the Goldwater style stuff. There's a new book coming out in the summer by a scholar named Henry Olson where he argues that Reagan was actually anti-Goldwater in several ways, kind of thing, right? So I don't know how true that is, but I think it's Reagan was more amenable to keeping the institutions the Johnsons and Nixons and Fords had created, right?
To what extent did Ronald Reagan cut domestic spending?
I don't know the numbers on that.
Right.
He certainly froze
in general-
domestic spending.
In general terms, right.
He certainly froze things.
Because that's
in a lot more-
that's the left-wing critique of
Yeah.
Reagan's
Yeah,
economy.
but again, that's nothing that it's not like he tried to repeal Social Security. It's not like he tried to go fundamentally question the basics of the welfare state. He didn't try to forward advance and reform the welfare state, but he didn't try to cut it back. So with Reagan, I just don't think he's as radically revolutionary as a lot of people think he was. But what he did do was he institutionalized a language and a party system and an elite that was all basically conservative.
So he was a culturally significant figure.
Culturally.
perhaps. In your view, maybe more culturally significant than policy, more culturally revolutionary than politically revolutionary in terms of the policies that he
But there was a revolution there, though, and I'll explain that in the fact that after Reagan, you can't talk like Eisenhower. You have to talk like Reagan. And that will naturally drive you towards the right and further to the right and further to the right as time goes on. And I think the consummation of Republican radicalism was really in the 1990s under people like Newt Gingrich.
Well, and that's where I wanted to go now.
Yes,
so,
go ahead.
Let's fast forward to the 90s and
Yeah.
see if we can catch up to our present
Sounds
day.
good, sounds good.
So Newt Gingrich comes in, and earlier we were talking about the polarization in American politics, right? And it's an interesting thing because there's a lot of polls that have tracked American political attitudes over the course of decades, right? And it shows that up until the 1990s, you always had some measure of polarization and so forth. But, consistently polls showed that Republicans did not have an overwhelmingly negative opinion of the Democratic Party and vice versa, up until about more or less the Monica Lewinsky scandal, right? And then things start to break down in a number of different ways. Now, I've heard old school senators say that Newt Gingrich sort of messed up the civility within Congress, right? Because Gingrich came in and he changed a bunch of things in different ways. I was telling you earlier, I was listening to Jonathan Haidt talking about how, I guess, Gingrich changed the congressional calendar to where, I guess, previously congressmen and women had been in Washington, D.C. doing business over the weekends oftentimes. And he changed it to where business was now done from, I think, Tuesday morning to Thursday evening. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was something like that, with the effect being that suddenly members of Congress from opposite sides of the aisle weren't around to hang out with each other during social hours.
Right.
Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill had a famously congenial collegiate relationship. And Chris Matthews, the host, show on MSNBC. Well, he was a Tip O'Neill staffer. I think he was chief of staff for Tip O'Neill. And I remember him telling a story. And Matthews is sort of an interesting guy because he's sort of an odd fit in the modern sort of Democratic sort of ideological spectrum because he still kind of wants to speak to that white working class voter that Trump did so well with. And we'll get to that because these things have all shifted. But he told a little story about Ronald Reagan, which I thought was kind of reflective of this. He said that Ronald Reagan came into Tip O'Neill's office one day looking for Tip. Tip wasn't there. Chris Matthews was there. And he said, "Where's Tip?" And Chris said something like, "Oh," he said, "he's not here." And I can't remember the exact quote, but Chris said something to Reagan like, "Oh, you're here to beat up on him about something, or you're here to pick a fight." And Ronald Reagan said, "No, not after 6 o'clock. After 6 o'clock, we're all friends." That's mine. Reagan's pretty easy voice.
Yeah.
This guy is pretty fair impersonator. You don't necessarily have to go down the list of voices.
Oh, I'm happy to if you want me to. But
I'm surprised you haven't done it already, honestly. But yes, I mean, there's a certain culture of civility. So, additionally, Gingrich changed the operations of at least the Republican Party in Congress. Maybe this applied to all of the House of Representatives. I'm not sure, but he changed it to where committee chairmanships were no longer awarded on the basis of seniority. They were now awarded strictly according to the discretion of the speaker. Right. And so that changed the culture of things because, when you have seniority and
you know what you're doing.
Well, not only do you know what you're doing, but you have the sort of leverage that allows you to compromise or interact with people on the other side of the aisle without feeling like you might lose your chairmanship because of it.
Right.
And basically, Gingrich came in and said, no, if you get too cozy with the Democrats, you're going to lose your chairmanship. Right. So these sorts of things sort of facilitated the breakdown, I guess, of the sort of fraternal spirit in the House of Representatives. But from a policy standpoint, from an intellectual standpoint, I mean, what else changed during the 90s that sort of helps account for where it is we are now as a party?
Well, I think the biggest thing...
With respect to the GOP.
Right. The biggest thing to keep in mind when you think about the 90s is not Bill Clinton and it's not George H.W. Bush. It's the Cold War ended. Mm. Previously, the thing that kept the different legs of the stool of conservatism together, and for our listeners, conservatism can be viewed as a stool of that has three legs. One of them is neoconservative military ideas, socially conservative social ideas, and economically libertarian economic ideas. And so those three legs don't really mesh well with each other very well, but they all formed an uneasy alliance against communism.
Right.
Libertarians didn't like communist collectivism. Social conservatives didn't like communist atheism, for lack of a better word, and neoconservatives didn't like communism as a threat on the world stage and wanted to spread democracy in place of it. Then the Soviet Union collapses in the late 80s and early 90s, and you no longer have that great evil empire, as Reagan called it, on the other side of the Atlantic to worry about.
Right.
And so there was a kind of aimlessness about, well, what is the real enemy now? You know, my friend and mentor Michael Lind, who's a great guy who you should have on the show eventually, back then predicted that the party was going to fall apart because the American right would shift to something that looked more like Donald Trump, just because they didn't have anything coherent against him. Now he was right on the prediction, but he was about 20 years too early on that prediction, 25 years too early, and so. When I look at the 90s and the 2000s, the Bush years, even the Obama years, I see a conservatism that is increasingly intellectually incoherent. It gets everything it wants in some ways, and it chokes on its own success and starts to fail. In two senses in particular. So number one, the neoconservative militaristic sense. The neoconservatives basically won U.S. foreign policy in the 90s and early 2000s with interventions around the world with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Look where that got us. That got us to the retrenchment of Obama and then the reaction of Donald Trump. On economics, there was a whole lot of deregulation, which deregulation, if you do it right, can be okay. But in the financial sector, a lot of that deregulation, it can be very well argued, led to increasing collapses every couple of years leading up to
Glass-Steagall, although Bill Clinton, of course,
yeah, but Bill Clinton was actually moderate, but closer to the right on a lot of high economics.
Right.
Not necessarily low economics, but higher economics.
Right.
And so...
the gravity of the Reagan years still had Bill Clinton sort of...
in his orbit, exactly.
Right, in his orbit, and hence, the era of small government is over.
Right, exactly.
So I'm going to ask you now,
Yeah.
to sort of look into your crystal ball a little bit in our final few minutes here.
Okay, sounds good.
And tell me, because we've sort of gone through the history of the Republican Party and so forth, and we've sort of seen all of these different shifts and changes. But looking forward, in the age of Trump, right? How do you predict the party is going to evolve at this point? Now that we've experienced what looks like another tectonic shift in the underlying philosophy of the Republican Party, because I think it's still fair to say that the base of the Republican Party is at its roots conservative.
Right.
You don't really have a resurgent progressivism of the Republican Party, but you now have this new nationalism.
Yes.
Right? So tell us what that is, and as quickly as you're able to, tell us where you see that going in the future and how that's ultimately going to pan out for the future of the party.
So the ground as it is right now is Congress and the state houses are controlled by standard Newt Gingrich, George W. Bush style conservatives. Policy-wise, in terms of school choice, in terms of cuts to various entitlement programs, there's nothing new on that kind of front. Voter-wise, voter bloc-wise, you have this new nationalism that is vociferously anti-immigrant and anti-elite. That doesn't really translate into much of a policy agenda, as the flailing first 2 months of Trump's term have kind of proven. Okay. I think, for me, the big question is, when is this house of cards going to collapse? I think when you have a Trump administration that doesn't really have a coherent domestic policy philosophy, plus all the scandals that keep coming through every other week.
Lightning round. Tell me what you think. I'm going to throw something at you. You just give me your reaction. Okay? Here we go. Bernie Sanders.
Interesting guy. I think he's too principled for his own good to get anything done in politics. So, and policy-wise, he's not wrong about the problems. I think he's very wrong about a lot of his prescriptions, but he's not wrong about the problems that we face.
Okay. Ron Paul.
Very similar, actually. Too principled for his own good. Not exactly a mirror flip side on the libertarian side from the Democratic Socialist side, but some of the problems he sees are very real. None of the solutions he has, I think, are terribly practical, but somebody who people in the center need to listen to in order to figure out how to address the problems that they have. Same thing with Sanders.
Okay, Ted Cruz.
I have so many words. Far too principled for
Sounds like
anybody's
you got a lot
good.
of four-letter words in there.
Yes. Well, and then one 6-letter word in there too, someplace. So, I just think Ted Cruz is what's wrong with the Republican Party. Is a look at this is what Reagan was kind of thing. The gradual year-by-year shift further and further right to say I'm more like Reagan than you are like Reagan kind of thing, And I think that is what's part of what's brought us into the mess that we're in right now.
John Kasich.
A nice guy I've heard. Probably not creative enough. Has the right kind of temperament for bipartisan governance. Definitely the right one, and I can't wait to see what he does moving forward. I don't really see him going very far in terms of fire in the belly, becoming president of the United States or anything like that. So,
Elizabeth Warren.
kind of like same area as Bernie Sanders, except more pragmatic and more practical than Sanders, and probably more capable and in that way more dangerous than him. I don't say that in a bad way. I say that like more capable of doing stuff. So,
Gavin Newsom.
well, I'm doing opposition research on him right now, so I think some of that might be confidential. So,
okay.
but like standard California political elite kind of thing. He has the right intentions, but probably doesn't know how to govern the state.
Okay. Occupy Wall Street.
Sanders, they got a lot of the problems right. They got most of the prescriptions wrong, and people who don't pay attention to them risk making worse versions of them come up in the further future.
Okay. Tea Party.
Same thing totally.
Black Lives Matter.
Addresses very important issues. Does it in the worst possible way.
Border wall with Mexico.
We have a fence over most of it. I don't see why we need a wall.
Okay. Muslim ban.
It's not a Muslim ban. It's also a stupid policy. And we need to figure out our terrorism, homeland security stuff better. But we can't do it in a populist kind of manner the way Trump is doing it.
Gay marriage.
I'm Catholic, so I have theological issues with it. In a civic sense, in a like civil society sense, like it's the law of the land. It's not going to change. So I tell my fellow social conservatives, stop fighting that fight. There are other hills to die on that are more important than it.
Marijuana legalization.
I don't have an opinion on it.
Okay. Tell me, who would your ideal president be?
John Huntsman.
John Huntsman.
John Huntsman, former governor of Utah, current ambassador to Russia, former ambassador to China. Moderate Republican, very bipartisan statesman, temperamentally cool, moderate guy.
Man, if CNN were capable of swinging the Republican primary, John Huntsman would have won by a landslide.
Yes, very much so. But the thing is, CNN doesn't swing the primary. That's Fox News' job. So.
Although Fox News sort of went to war with Donald Trump and
They
lost.
did. That's true. That's true.
During the primary.
Well, so
Trump beat the media.
Yes.
Up one side and down the other. You can almost say he pimped the media. I mean, not to be crude, but I mean, he got all of this free coverage, turned around and vilified him. Now, look, after the primaries, they said, and I'm a big critic of Donald Trump, but it's a testament to how bad the media is a lot of times, that you can have so much wrong, you can have so much that is wrong with an individual like Donald Trump as political candidate and in so many other ways, and still have about half of what's said about him be over the top or exaggerated or false, right?
Well, so I was actually talking to some Huntsman aides over the last couple of weeks, and one of them told me that it's shocking to see how much of the Huntsman pragmatic policy agenda Donald Trump's campaign took and drove it to the other extreme. But they tapped into stuff that the Huntsman campaign was tapping into in its kind of unorthodox way back in 2012. And in that way, it's not to say that Donald Trump is a moderate Republican, because he's not by any means. Yeah. But if he's part Pat Buchanan, part populist, part crazy Jacksonian, he's also part pragmatic old line Republican too. And I think it's like one of those wars between the two wolves. Which one is he going to feed? I think there's evidence that he's feeding the nice wolf, in the sense that Jim Mattis, Rex Tillerson are very competent and very able secretaries of state and defense.
Okay.
But I also think the fact that he tweets every other week and tweets the things that he does every other day is a sign that the bad wolf is being fed too.
One more question.
Yes.
Is Hamilton the musical? Is that coming back? Is that coming to Los Angeles anytime soon?
Should be in the spring.
Okay, right. Do you actually know all the words to the Hamilton musical?
I would say I
I
have
heard
maybe
that.
2/3 of
I think
it.
I heard it from myself, but I definitely heard that about you, that you knew every lyric.
Not every lyric, because some of the songs are definitely higher quality than the other ones. But I would never back down if it came down to a contest of that kind of
Okay.
thing. So.
Yeah. Before we go, give me one of your best impressions.
I think President Richard Nixon was one of the greatest presidents of the United States, and he was not a crook. He was not a quitter. He was not a crook. He knows what is best for this country in ways that you plebeian proletariats have no idea.
Not a crook. Neither is Luke Phillips. Luke, thank you so much, man.
John.
Appreciate it.
a lot.
All right.